Edmund Campion abandoned his political privilege as a top scholar under Queen Elizabeth I to secretly join a religious organization classified as a national security threat. When he illegally re-entered London, the Royal Intelligence Network immediately hunted him down on espionage charges. The government formally charged him with treason and proceeded with the torture. Inside the Tower of London, executioners used the stretching rack to dislocate his joints. At the Tyburn execution ground, the executioner hanged him until near death before cutting open his abdomen to pull out his organs. The British authorities completely dismembered his body to deter any rebellious intentions against the throne. 16th century Tudor England merged religion with national security. The country's official faith shifted drastically within a single generation. Citizens experienced sudden changes from Henry VIII's early system to Edward VI's Protestantism, then to Mary I's Catholicism, and finally to Elizabeth I's Anglican state. Religious adherence functioned as a strict test of civic loyalty rather than a private matter. The Elizabethan government classified opposing theological doctrines as high treason. Officials viewed Catholicism as a direct foreign threat supported by the Pope and the Spanish Empire. The state apparatus operated with intense surveillance to detect any ideological dissent. Edmund Campion was born directly into this heavily monitored society on January 24, 1540. Campion lacked aristocratic wealth and political privilege. His father worked as a bookseller operating a small stall in the courtyard of London's St. Paul's Cathedral. This specific location provided a significant early advantage. St. Paul's churchyard served as the primary center of the English printing industry and academic commerce. Daily exposure to translated manuscripts, classical philosophy, and scholarly debates shaped Campion's early years. He absorbed advanced vocabulary and rhetorical logic straight from this busy intellectual marketplace. His exceptional memory and analytical mind quickly distinguished him from other children. These capabilities eventually secured his admission to Christ's Hospital. Founded by King Edward VI in 1552, Christ's Hospital occupied the grounds of a dissolved monastery. It was a specialized institution established by the state to provide a rigorous elite education to gifted children from impoverished urban backgrounds. The curriculum was brutal, exacting, and heavily focused on mastering Latin grammar, classical rhetoric, and strict discipline. His exceptional performance at the hospital attracted the attention of the Worshipful Company of Grocers. This organization was a wealthy, influential London merchant guild dealing in imported spices and dry goods. Operating as a philanthropic sponsor, the grocers recognized Campion's raw intellectual capital. They selected him as their official exhibitioner, establishing a financial pipeline that paid his full academic tuition and provided his living expenses. This financial launchpad propelled a working-class boy directly into the elite academic stratosphere of Tudor England. His talent was undeniable and rapidly utilized by the state for public relations. In August 1553, when the Catholic Queen Mary I successfully suppressed the usurpation of Lady Jane Grey and rode triumphantly into London to claim her throne, the city government required a flawless representative. They selected the 13-year-old Edmund Campion to stand before the monarch and deliver the official welcoming oration in classical Latin. It was the first documented historical record of a rhetorical voice that would eventually challenge the fundamental architecture of the English state. Funded continuously by the Grocers' Company, Campion entered St. John's College, Oxford in 1557. The college had been founded a mere 2 years prior by Sir Thomas White, a wealthy merchant, former Lord Mayor of London, and a fierce Catholic traditionalist. Sir Thomas White held an unspoken strategic objective in founding the college. He intended to preserve traditional Catholic academic methodologies as an ideological bulwark against the sweeping Protestant reforms taking hold across the university system. White personally identified Campion as a valuable seed for the future of the institution, deliberately placing him in a conservative academic environment that solidified his foundational theological core. Campion rapidly conquered the academic hierarchy of Oxford. He earned his Bachelor of Arts degree in 1560 and was appointed as a junior fellow at the unprecedented age of 17. In 1564, he secured his Master of Arts and was appointed as a primary lecturer in rhetoric. His public profile exploded during a period of national political crisis. In 1560, Amy Robsart, the wife of Queen Elizabeth's favorite courtier, Robert Dudley, died under suspicious circumstances at Cumnor Place, threatening to bring down Dudley's political faction and severely damage the crown's reputation. The university administration tasked the 20-year-old Campion with the sensitive assignment of delivering her official funeral oration in Latin. Navigating a lethal political minefield where a single misplaced phrase could result in state prosecution, Campion delivered a masterpiece of academic diplomacy. He deployed his formidable rhetorical mastery to soothe public outrage, successfully protecting the university's institutional reputation and permanently securing the favor of Dudley's powerful political allies. Simultaneously, Campion revolutionized Oxford's internal academic culture. He entirely dismantled the dry, rigid scholastic debate structures of the Middle Ages that had previously dominated the university. In their place, Campion adopted and taught the elegant, flowing, persuasive rhetoric of the Roman statesman Cicero. He possessed a charismatic, magnetic intellect that drew the academic elite directly into his orbit. The younger students and junior fellows at Oxford formed a distinct devoted subculture known colloquially as the Campionists. These students obsessively copied his complex Latin sentence structures, mimicked his specific tone of voice during public lectures, adopted his manner of academic dress, and even imitated his physical posture. By his mid-20s, Edmund Campion was the undisputed intellectual leader of an entire generation of future English elites. His crowning worldly triumph and ultimate political validation occurred in September 1566. Queen Elizabeth I, accompanied by the highest-ranking members of her Privy Council, including the masterful state architect William Cecil and the current Chancellor of Oxford, Robert Dudley, conducted an extensive, highly publicized 6-day royal visitation to the university. The primary geopolitical objective of the royal visit was to force the deeply conservative academic establishment of Oxford to demonstrate public submission to the Protestant crown. The university administration required their finest mind to represent them before the sovereign. The 26-year-old Edmund Campion was chosen to lead the premier public debates on natural philosophy, tasked with arguing complex astronomical theories based on the works of Aristotle directly before the Queen. Campion executed the assignment flawlessly. He seamlessly wove sophisticated, multi-layered flattery directed at the Queen and her senior ministers into the core of his philosophical arguments. He transformed a standard academic exercise into a diplomatic triumph. Queen Elizabeth I was mesmerized by his intellect and rhetorical delivery. She publicly praised his performance and explicitly encouraged him to enter a career in state politics. Robert Dudley immediately stepped forward to become his official, powerful patron. William Cecil, the ruthless, pragmatic political mastermind of the Tudor surveillance state, observed the young scholar and publicly declared Campion to be one of the diamonds of England. The Crown recognized this extraordinary potential, fully intending to utilize his brilliance for the Protestant regime. At this exact historical moment, the path to immense aristocratic wealth, supreme political power, and the highest executive offices of the state church lay unhindered open to him. The administrative regulations of Oxford University dictated a strict pipeline for academic and political advancement. To secure his status as a senior fellow and proceed toward the highest echelons of state administration, Campion was legally required to obtain a Bachelor of Divinity. This degree was not a purely academic classification. It possessed an absolute political prerequisite. To receive it, a scholar had to be officially ordained within the Church of England and publicly swear the oath of supremacy. The oath of supremacy, codified by the 1559 Act of Supremacy, was the foundational legal pillar of the Elizabethan state. It forced the swearer to legally acknowledge Queen Elizabeth I as the supreme governor of the Church and to unequivocally reject the spiritual and political authority of the Pope. In the Tudor intelligence apparatus, taking the oath was a definitive litmus test for civic loyalty. Refusal to swear was an administrative crime. Repeated refusal was classified as high treason. For the first 28 years of his life, Campion had successfully navigated the ideological whiplash of the era by focusing exclusively on classical rhetoric and natural philosophy, disciplines that remained largely neutral in the violent theological wars between Protestantism and Catholicism. He had utilized his charm and his mastery of Cicero to evade making a definitive public declaration of faith. But the university regulations now forced a binary choice: swear absolute allegiance to the state religion or forfeit his entire academic career, his income, and his social standing. Faced with the impending requirement of the oath, Campion initiated a period of intense, localized theological research between 1567 and 1568. Bypassing the contemporary political propaganda of the Tudor state, he immersed himself directly in the primary source texts of the early Church Fathers. His objective was to locate historical justification for the Anglican settlement, to intellectually validate the compromise he was about to make. The result was the exact opposite. Operating with a photographic memory and trained analytical logic, Campion realized with terrifying clarity that the historical original theology of the early Church aligned seamlessly with the doctrines of Roman Catholicism. He concluded that the reformed, state-mandated doctrines of Anglicanism were not a purification of the ancient faith. Instead, they were an artificial, recent political invention designed to consolidate the executive power of the Tudor monarchy. The profound guilt of this contradiction deeply unsettled him. He was the leading intellectual light of a university designed to produce Anglican ministers. Yet, he now fundamentally believed the Anglican Church was a heretical institution divorced from historical Christianity. The theoretical crisis rapidly escalated into a physical, immediate confrontation through a clandestine meeting with William Allen. William Allen was a former principal of St. Mary's Hall, Oxford, who possessed an intellectual pedigree similar to Campion's. However, Allen had entirely rejected the Elizabethan religious settlement. He abandoned his prestigious status, his wealth, and his country, choosing to live in permanent exile on the European continent. During a covert visit to Oxford, Allen met privately with Campion. Allen's physical poverty, his loss of status, and his uncompromising orthodoxy stood in stark contrast to Campion's comfortable fellowship, effectively exposing the scholar's internal hypocrisy. Allen had sacrificed everything for doctrinal truth, while Campion, despite knowing the theological reality, continued to enjoy the financial benefits, the warm rooms, and the elite status provided by a state church he believed to be false. Allen systematically dismantled the justifications Campion had constructed. He reframed the scholar's outward conformity not as a necessity of academic diplomacy, but as a calculated evasion of historical truth. The intelligence network of the Tudor state, combined with the administrative oversight of his financial sponsors, began to detect the ideological shift within Campion. The worshipful company of grocers, the London Merchant Guild that had entirely funded his education since childhood, grew suspicious of his continuous evasion of theological duties and his rumored Catholic sympathies. In 1568, the grocers issued a direct administrative ultimatum. To prove his Protestant orthodoxy and justify their continued financial investment, the Guild demanded that Campion travel to London and preach a public sermon at Paul's Cross. Paul's Cross was not merely a pulpit, it was the primary open-air broadcasting center for the Tudor government, situated immediately outside St. Paul's Cathedral. Sermons delivered at Paul's Cross were heavily vetted by the Bishop of London and utilized to disseminate state propaganda, denounce political enemies, and enforce ideological conformity to audiences of thousands. Campion recognized that preaching at Paul's Cross would require him to publicly attack the Catholic faith and endorse the Elizabethan settlement on the national stage. He could not bring himself to execute the betrayal. He deployed his rhetorical skills to stall, offering complex, evasive excuses to the grocer's company, requesting more time for academic preparation. The merchants of London possessed no patience for academic evasion. Recognizing that their primary exhibitioner was ideologically compromised, the grocer's company executed a unilateral breach of contract. They permanently severed his funding. Almost overnight, the financial launchpad that had sustained Campion's elite existence was annihilated. Facing immediate financial ruin, the imminent loss of his prestigious Oxford Fellowship, and the terrifying prospect of state investigation, Campion sought a mechanism for survival. He succumbed to the persuasive pressure of Richard Cheney, the Bishop of Gloucester. Cheney occupied a unique, anomalous position within the Elizabethan Church. He was an Anglican bishop, but he harbored deep conservative, almost Catholic, theological sympathies. He advocated for a doctrine of church papism, the belief that an individual could outwardly conform to the state religion, attend Anglican services, and even accept ordination, while privately, internally maintaining their true Catholic faith. Cheney provided Campion with a sophisticated intellectual rationalization. He argued that taking Anglican orders was merely an administrative requirement, a temporary political necessity that did not permanently bind the soul. He convinced the desperate scholar that he could accept ordination as a deacon in the Church of England, thereby securing his fellowship and his income, without fully compromising his internal Catholic beliefs. Driven by fear of poverty and the psychological terror of losing the only academic environment he had ever known, Campion yielded. In early 1569, he was officially ordained as a deacon in the Church of England by Bishop Cheney. The moment the ordination ceremony concluded, the intellectual rationalization collapsed. Campion experienced a devastating psychological ruin. He viewed his compromise not as a pragmatic survival tactic, but as an act of profound, unforgivable spiritual treason. He had sworn an oath to a religious structure he believed to be false, selling his soul for the worldly comfort of an Oxford Fellowship. The guilt manifested physically. He refused to wear the mandated Anglican vestments required of his new office. He dodged all public religious duties, avoided participating in the sacraments of the state church, and fell into a deep, paralyzing state of clinical depression. The Crown's most celebrated scholar was effectively destroying himself from the inside out. Recognizing that his physical presence in Oxford was no longer sustainable, and that his mental state was collapsing under the weight of his hypocrisy, Campion required an immediate extraction from the primary surveillance zones of the English state. In 1571, he fled the university entirely. He sought political asylum across the Irish Sea, traveling to Dublin under the high-level protection of two powerful political operatives, James Stanihurst, the Speaker of the Irish House of Commons, and Sir Henry Sidney, the Lord Deputy of Ireland. Stanihurst and Sidney were ambitious state builders attempting to construct a centralized, educated administrative apparatus in Ireland that mirrored the English system. They identified Campion's intellectual capability and recruited him to spearhead a major academic initiative, the foundational planning and establishment of a new university in Dublin, which would eventually become Trinity College. Campion accepted the assignment, desperately attempting to hide his severe religious dissent behind the shield of academic labor. He lived in the household of James Stanihurst, tutoring his son, Richard, and heavily immersed himself in historical research. During this brief period of relative stability, he authored A History of Ireland, a sophisticated, beautifully written analytical text that provided a comprehensive overview of Irish geography, culture, and political history from a distinctly English administrative perspective. Campion's retreat to the periphery of the empire was abruptly severed by a political directive originating in Rome. In 1570, Pope Pius V issued Regnans in Excelsis. This papal bull functioned as a direct declaration of war against the Tudor state. The bull excommunicated Queen Elizabeth I, declaring her an illegitimate heretic who possessed no true authority to govern. Crucially, the document absolved all English and Irish subjects from their oaths of allegiance to the Queen, commanding them to disobey her laws. Regnans in Excelsis destroyed the middle ground. Prior to 1570, English Catholics could maintain a quiet internal resistance while outwardly demonstrating civic loyalty to the crown. Following its publication, the Elizabethan state apparatus underwent a paranoid paradigm shift. Roman Catholicism was no longer viewed as a traditional, albeit illegal, religious preference. It was now legally classified as an active, hostile political ideology synonymous with high treason and foreign invasion. Every Catholic within the realm was instantly categorized as a potential sleeper agent for the Spanish Empire or the papacy. The shockwave of the papal bull reached Ireland rapidly. The Tudor state immediately implemented aggressive religious laws across the Pale, the area of Ireland directly controlled by the English administration. The intelligence network, operating under the directives of the Privy Council in London, intensified its surveillance of known academic and political dissenters. Edmund Campion's sudden departure from Oxford, his refusal to preach, and his suspect theological leanings made him an immediate target. The administration in Dublin received a direct warrant from London authorizing his arrest and interrogation regarding his religious loyalties. The high-level protection provided by Stanihurst and Sidney evaporated. Recognizing that harboring a suspected Catholic traitor was now a lethal political liability, they informed Campion he had to run. Campion fled Dublin and went underground. He was forced to rely on the clandestine network of Irish Catholic resistance. He relocated to Turvey, a heavily fortified rural estate controlled by Sir Christopher Barnewall, a prominent member of the Old English nobility who secretly maintained Catholic sympathies. At Turvey, the brilliant Oxford scholar was reduced to the status of a hunted fugitive. He was forced to move continuously between safe houses, hiding in barns and damp basements to avoid the relentless sweeps conducted by the Queen's search parties. He recognized that his physical presence in the British Isles was a mathematical impossibility. The intelligence net was closing, and capture meant inevitable torture and execution. To survive, and to finally reconcile the deep guilt of his Anglican ordination, Edmund Campion required a complete, highly dangerous extraction to the European continent. In March 1572, Campion initiated a dangerous exfiltration operation. The primary logistical hurdle was bypassing the stringent security protocols at the English and Irish ports. The Tudor state maintained a rigorous system of travel documentation. No individual could legally board a vessel departing the realm without a signed passport from the Privy Council or a recognized port authority, specifically designed to prevent the outflow of Catholic dissidents and the inflow of foreign agents. To circumvent this security matrix, the former Oxford scholar completely discarded his elite aristocratic aesthetic. Campion assumed the identity of a low-level illiterate servant. Utilizing the alias Patrick, he disguised himself in cheap, worn clothing, deliberately covering his face and hands in soot and dirt to mask his refined features. He was smuggled aboard a merchant vessel scheduled to cross the English Channel to the Spanish Netherlands, modern-day Belgium, and northern France. Because he lacked official documentation, he could not travel as a registered passenger. Campion was forced to hide deep within the dark, cramped cargo hold of the ship. Before the vessel cleared the harbor, it was boarded by the Queen's search parties. State officers, armed with arrest warrants specifically listing Campion's name, physically inspected the ship, interrogating the captain and the registered passengers. Hiding in the absolute darkness of the hold, Campion evaded visual detection. The ship cleared the port authority and entered the channel, successfully transporting the most wanted intellectual in the empire out of the English jurisdiction. Upon landing in Flanders, Campion traveled directly to the town of Douai. This location functioned as the strategic epicenter of the exiled English Catholic community. By the time Campion arrived, the English college, originally founded by William Allen, had evolved from a small academic refuge into a heavily fortified theological pipeline funded by the Spanish crown and the papacy. Rather than merely preserving the old faith, the institution now operated as a sophisticated intelligence and training hub. Its curriculum was explicitly designed to prepare disciplined operatives for the lethal geopolitical objective of re-infiltrating England and dismantling the Anglican state from within. For Campion, arriving at Douai represented the termination of his psychological crisis. He submitted himself immediately to the authority of the college. In a formal, documented process, he publicly and unequivocally renounced the Anglican ordination he had received from Bishop Cheney. He officially declared the Church of England to be a heretical institution. He received the sacrament of penance, formally reconciling his soul with the Roman Catholic Church. Freed from the cognitive dissonance that had paralyzed him in Oxford, his massive intellectual capabilities immediately re-engaged. He resumed his rigorous academic studies under Catholic doctrine, rapidly completing his Bachelor of Divinity in 1573. However, Campion recognized that serving as a secular priest attached to a diocese was insufficient for the scale of the ideological war he intended to wage. He required maximum operational discipline. In the summer of 1573, seeking to strip away the remnants of his Oxford privilege and subject himself to physical and spiritual discipline, Campion departed Douai for Rome. He did not travel by carriage or on horseback. He executed the journey as a traditional ascetic pilgrimage, walking entirely barefoot across the European continent, crossing the Alps, and descending into the Italian peninsula. Upon arriving in Rome, Campion formally applied for admission into the Society of Jesus. The Jesuits, founded by the former Spanish soldier Ignatius of Loyola, were the undisputed elite vanguard of the Catholic Counter-Reformation. Unlike traditional monastic orders that isolated themselves in cloisters to pray, the Jesuits were forged as a mobile, intellectually supreme, and militarily disciplined organization. They referred to themselves as the Company of Jesus, utilizing strict hierarchical command structures that mirrored an army. Their primary operational directives were to infiltrate hostile territories, establish elite educational institutions to control the intellectual development of the next generation, and engage directly in high-level theological debate to dismantle Protestant ideologies. They required absolute unquestioning obedience to their superiors and to the Pope. For a man possessing Campion's formidable academic weaponry and his intense desire for martyrdom, the Jesuit order was the optimal deployment vehicle. The Jesuit command in Rome accurately assessed Campion's psychological profile. They recognized his unparalleled intellect. However, they also identified his deeply ingrained academic pride, cultivated during his years as Oxford's undisputed star. Before he could be deployed for the Catholic cause, his ego had to be systematically dismantled. To break his pride, the Jesuit superiors did not assign him to a prestigious theological academy in Rome. Instead, they dispatched him to the far eastern frontier of the ideological conflict, the Kingdom of Bohemia, modern-day Czech Republic. Campion was stationed in the cities of Prague and Brno. He was stripped of all public status and forced to undergo the rigorous, humbling Jesuit novitiate. He was assigned menial, physical labor, required to scrub floors, work in the kitchens, and tend to the sick in the local hospitals. Once his ego was deemed sufficiently subjugated to the discipline of the order, his academic parameters were re-engaged. He was assigned to teach rhetoric and philosophy at the newly established Jesuit college in Prague. During his time in Bohemia, Campion perfected his command of theology, mastering the arguments required to deconstruct Protestant doctrine. In 1578, after 5 years of intense spiritual and academic conditioning, Edmund Campion was officially ordained as a Catholic priest by the Archbishop of Prague. For a brief period, he found operational stability, serving as a respected academic within the safety of the Habsburg Empire. While Campion operated in Bohemia, the demographic reality for the Catholic community inside England was entering a terminal phase. The Elizabethan state had implemented an effective strategy of bureaucratic attrition. The government did not initially rely on mass executions, which could trigger rebellions. Instead, they utilized strict penal laws. It was illegal to celebrate the Catholic Mass. Refusal to attend the state-mandated Anglican services resulted in crushing, compounding state fines designed to financially cripple Catholic families. Recusants. More critically, the state established a total blockade on the production of Catholic clergy. All universities and seminaries in England were strictly controlled by the Anglican establishment. As the older generation of Catholic priests who had been ordained during the reign of Queen Mary began to die of old age, they were not being replaced. William Allen and the Catholic leadership in exile ran the mathematical projections and realized that without a necessary influx of newly ordained priests, the Catholic sacraments would cease to exist in England within a single generation. The Catholic faith was facing systematic, silent extinction. To prevent this demographic collapse, William Allen, operating in coordination with another highly capable English Jesuit named Robert Persons, traveled to Rome. They actively lobbied Pope Gregory XIII and the Superior General of the Jesuits, Everard Mercurian, to authorize a dangerous, covert operation, the Jesuit English Mission. The objective was to deploy elite, Jesuit-trained priests directly into the hostile territory of England to administer the sacraments, sustain the underground Catholic network, and halt the rate of Protestant conversions. The papacy and the Jesuit leadership agreed, but they imposed strict operational parameters. The mission directives were explicitly spiritual. The priests were ordered to focus entirely on theology and the administration of the sacraments. They were forbidden from engaging in any political discussions, involving themselves in matters of state, or participating in any plots to assassinate or depose Queen Elizabeth I. The Jesuit command evaluated their available personnel and selected the 2 most capable English operatives in their ranks to lead the infiltration. Robert Persons was appointed as the mission commander and logistical coordinator. Edmund Campion was recalled from Prague and explicitly ordered to serve as the primary theological asset and public face of the intellectual assault. The decision to deploy the Jesuits was classified within Rome, but the Tudor state possessed the most sophisticated, funded intelligence apparatus in 16th century Europe. The network was commanded by Sir Francis Walsingham, the Queen's principal secretary. Walsingham operated a massive, decentralized matrix of informants, cryptographers, and double agents stationed at every major diplomatic hub, seminary, and port across the European continent. He heavily bribed servants, working within the English College at Douai and the English College in Rome. Consequently, the Elizabethan state was not caught off guard by the Jesuit mission. Walsingham's network intercepted the intelligence months before the priests even reached the English Channel. The exact identities, the detailed physical descriptions, and the proposed travel aliases of Campion, Persons, and their entire network of operatives were compiled into intelligence dossiers. These dossiers were sitting directly on the desks of the Privy Council in Whitehall, and arrest warrants were dispatched to every port authority along the English coast, long before the Jesuits boarded a ship. On June 24, 1580, Edmund Campion initiated the infiltration. He crossed the English Channel and slipped into the port of Dover. Recognizing that traveling as an academic or a cleric would guarantee immediate detention, Campion adopted a specialized commercial cover. He disguised himself as a wealthy professional jewel merchant, utilizing the operational alias Mr. Edmunds. Despite the sophisticated cover, the port security at Dover was on high alert. The customs officers, cross-referencing incoming passengers with the intelligence reports provided by Walsingham, immediately flagged Campion. He was detained on the docks and brought directly before the mayor of Dover on suspicion of being an enemy of the state. At this precise moment, Campion's mission should have ended in immediate transfer to the Tower of London. However, a fatal bureaucratic flaw in Walsingham's intelligence transmission provided a momentary gap in the security net. The physical arrest warrant possessed by the mayor of Dover correctly identified the incoming threat as a highly educated Catholic operative, but it listed the primary target's name incorrectly. The warrant ordered the arrest of Gabriel Allen, the brother of William Allen, not Edmund Campion. Brought before the mayor for interrogation, Campion realized the discrepancy in the paperwork. He immediately deployed his elite Oxford-trained rhetorical skills. He did not lie directly about being Gabriel Allen. Instead, he wielded complex circular logic and highly specific legalistic phrasing to aggressively dismantle the mayor's confidence in his own documentation. Campion argued that detaining a legitimate jewel merchant based on a warrant for a man bearing an entirely different name constituted a severe breach of common law and threatened the mayor with personal legal retaliation for disrupting commerce. The mayor of Dover, a provincial administrator lacking the intellectual capacity to combat the greatest rhetorician of the era, became deeply flustered and doubted his own orders. Intimidated by Campion's aggressive legal posturing and the clear error on the warrant, the mayor capitulated. He signed a formal state-authorized travel pass, effectively granting the Jesuit operative legal permission to travel freely within the realm. Campion took the documentation, walked out of the Port Authority, and vanished seamlessly into the English countryside. The intelligence apparatus had failed. The most dangerous intellectual asset of the Catholic Counter-Reformation was now operating undetected behind enemy lines. The survival of the Jesuit operatives depended entirely on the recusant community. Recusants were English Catholics who explicitly defied the 1559 Act of Uniformity by refusing to attend the state-mandated Anglican church services. This demographic was primarily composed of the traditional rural nobility and the landed gentry who possessed the financial resources to absorb the crushing, compounding state fines levied for non-compliance. Campion's operational methodology was strictly regulated. He moved continuously, never remaining in a single location for more than a few days to prevent the local informants from establishing a recognizable pattern. His operational theater encompassed a vast geographic area, moving fluidly through the counties of Berkshire, Oxfordshire, Northamptonshire, and as far north as Lancashire. He approached the fortified manor houses of the recusant gentry exclusively under the cover of darkness. To mask his movements across the countryside, Campion utilized a revolving matrix of false identities and physical disguises. He rotated between presenting himself as a traveling merchant, a high-status gentleman, or a low-level servant, adjusting his vocabulary and physical posture to match the assumed class parameters. Upon entering a safe house, the operational protocols were specific. He heard confessions and celebrated the Catholic Mass secretly in the hours immediately before dawn. These services were conducted in modified rooms, often damp basements or isolated attics. The architecture of these manor houses was actively being adapted as a defense mechanism against the state. Wealthy Catholic families commissioned specialized carpenters and masons to construct priest holes, sophisticated, suffocatingly narrow compartments built directly into the thick stone walls, beneath the heavy oak floorboards, or behind false fireplaces. These hides were purpose-built to conceal a human being from state search parties, for days at a time, equipped with hidden latches and sound-dampening materials. Campion possessed an acute understanding of the Tudor justice system. He recognized that if he were captured, the state would not prosecute him on purely religious grounds, as executing a man for theology would validate his status as a martyr. Instead, the government would inevitably utilize physical torture to extract a fabricated confession, branding him as a political traitor involved in an international conspiracy to assassinate the Queen. To counteract this anticipated state propaganda, Campion executed a brilliant preemptive public relations maneuver. Shortly after his arrival in England, he drafted a formal manifesto addressed directly to the Queen's Privy Council. The document established clear rules for Campion's mission, starting with his declaration as a Jesuit priest returning solely to serve the Catholic people. He strictly avoided politics under papal orders and firmly denied any involvement in plots against the crown. Furthermore, he used his Oxford education to challenge Anglican scholars to a public debate before the Queen, aiming to openly defend Catholic teachings against the state's theology. Campion provided the handwritten manuscript to Thomas Pound, a prominent Catholic layman currently held under house arrest in Southwark. Campion's explicit instruction was to hold the document as a fail-safe, to be published only in the event of his capture. However, Pound immediately recognized the propaganda value of the text. Recognizing that Campion's capture was probable, Poundy bypassed the instructions. He rapidly hand-copied the manuscript and distributed it throughout the underground Catholic network. The manifesto, quickly dubbed Campion's Brag by the English public, went viral across the kingdom. The unauthorized publication of the Brag was a strategic victory for the Jesuits and a catastrophic embarrassment for the Tudor regime. Campion had successfully set the narrative parameters before the state could capture him. He humiliated the Anglican establishment by publicly challenging their theological competence, and he pushed the state's manhunt into an absolute paranoid frenzy. Walsingham's security apparatus was now actively hunting a ghost who was publicly mocking their efficiency. Campion recognized that handwritten manuscripts were insufficient for the scale of the ideological war he intended to wage. To effectively dismantle the theological foundation of the Anglican state, he required the capability to mass-produce complex academic texts. He needed a printing press. In the 16th century, the Tudor state maintained a total, ruthless monopoly on the printing industry. The Stationers' Company in London strictly regulated all publications, and operating an unlicensed press was a severe federal crime. To bypass this censorship, the Jesuit network established a sophisticated clandestine typographical operation. They acquired a printing press, disassembled it, and smuggled the heavy iron and wood components, along with recognizable Catholic typography fonts and reams of imported paper, deep into the woods of Oxfordshire. The press was reassembled in the attic of Stoner Park, a heavily fortified, isolated Catholic estate near Henley-on-Thames. Operating in absolute secrecy, with lookouts posted in the surrounding forests, Campion wrote and oversaw the printing of his masterwork, Decem Rationes, 10 Reasons. The book was a devastating, razor-sharp critique of Anglican theology. Written in flawless academic Latin, Campion laid out 10 distinct, logically unassailable arguments demonstrating that the Reformed State Church lacked historical precedent, scriptural validity, and patristic support. He utilized the precise rhetorical architecture he had perfected at Oxford to systematically dismantle the intellectual credibility of the Elizabethan religious settlement. Printing Decem Rationes was only the first phase of the operation. The strategic deployment of the text required a visible, high-impact target. Campion did not distribute the book to the general public. He aimed it directly at the intellectual core of the English state. On June 27, 1581, Oxford University held its prestigious annual graduation ceremonies, the Act at St. Mary's Church. The church was packed with the highest-ranking academic elites of the realm, prominent government officials, and the future administrators of the Tudor state. Operating under Walsingham's massive security net, a coordinated team of Catholic operatives successfully infiltrated the heavily guarded university grounds. Before the ceremonies began, they systematically planted exactly 400 freshly printed, bound copies of Decem Rationes directly on the benches and in the stalls of St. Mary's Church. When the Anglican academics and government officials arrived and took their seats, they found Campion's theological explosive waiting for them. The psychological and political impact was immediate. The operation demonstrated that the Jesuit underground network was not merely a disorganized group of fugitives. It was a highly sophisticated, heavily funded intelligence operation capable of breaching the most secure, prestigious institutions in the kingdom. Sir Francis Walsingham and the Privy Council were publicly humiliated. Driven by absolute paranoia and the realization that the Catholic ideological offensive was gaining significant traction among the intellectual elite, the state rapidly escalated its legal response. In 1581, Parliament passed a draconian piece of legislation, formerly known as the Religion Act of 1581, often referred to as the Act of Persuasions. This new legislation fundamentally altered the legal definition of treason. The Act explicitly defined the mere act of attempting to convert an English subject to Roman Catholicism, or withdrawing a subject from their obedience to the state church, as high treason, punishable by the most extreme forms of execution. The state essentially criminalized the spoken word. Fueled by massive financial bounties and aggressive espionage, the manhunt finally closed around Campion in July 1581. Campion was traveling through Berkshire and sought temporary refuge at Lyford Grange, a heavily fortified, moated manor house owned by the prominent Catholic Yaté family. The estate functioned as a major logistical hub for the underground network and was currently sheltering a large community of Brigittine nuns. The operational security of Lyford Grange was compromised by an effective government infiltrator. George Eliot was a professional state spy who successfully masqueraded as a devout, persecuted recusant. Eliot managed to penetrate the outer perimeter of the Catholic network and tracked Campion directly to the estate. On July 11, 1581, having visually confirmed Campion's presence within the manor, Eliot immediately signaled David Jenkins, a local magistrate, and mobilized a heavily armed detachment of the local militia. As the armed men swarmed the exterior of the property and breached the heavy oak doors, the internal security protocols of the manor were immediately activated. Campion, along with two fellow underground priests, Thomas Ford and John Colton, were rapidly ushered into a sophisticated priest hole hidden in the wall above the main staircase. The compartment was a masterpiece of architectural concealment, but its physical confines were punishing. The hide was completely devoid of natural light and lacked any functional ventilation system. It was designed to maximize concealment by minimizing physical space. For 3 consecutive days and nights, Campion, Ford, and Colton lay completely immobilized in the pitch-black void. They were curled tightly against each other in an agonizing, cramped position, entirely unable to stretch their limbs or adjust their posture. They were provided with absolutely no water and no food. In the suffocating darkness, the 3 priests listened in absolute silence as the state militia methodically tore apart the interior of Lyford Grange. The soldiers utilized axes and heavy hammers to smash through the oak paneling, rip up the floorboards, and physically tear the architectural structure of the house apart, searching for the hollow cavities that indicated a priest hole. The endurance of the priests outlasted the initial search. By July 17, the militia had largely exhausted their efforts, having failed to locate the primary hide. The commanding officers were preparing to officially abandon the search and withdraw their forces from the heavily damaged estate. The capture of Edmund Campion ultimately hinged on a single, entirely accidental physical interaction. As a state guard was walking down the main staircase, preparing to exit the property, he casually tapped the wooden wall paneling above the stairs with the iron head of his hammer. The acoustic response was fatal. The wood did not return the solid, dense thud of thick Tudor masonry. It echoed with a distinct hollow resonance. The guard immediately halted the withdrawal and alerted the commanders. The militia converged on the staircase and violently smashed the wooden paneling apart with their axes and crowbars. The splintered wood gave way, exposing the pitch-black compartment. Edmund Campion, severely dehydrated, physically crippled by muscle cramps after 3 days of total immobility, and blinded by the sudden influx of light, was physically dragged out of the wall by the state forces. The most extensive, publicized manhunt of the Elizabethan era had successfully secured its primary target. The Crown's sharpest mind was now securely in the custody of the executioners. To destroy his aura of intellectual untouchability, the state engineered a spectacle of public humiliation. Campion was mounted on a horse, his arms bound tightly behind his back and his legs lashed together beneath the animal's belly to prevent any dignified posture. A massive paper placard was pinned to his hat, bearing the inscription, "Campion, the seditious Jesuit." He was paraded through the densely packed, hostile streets of London toward the Tower. Upon arrival, the physical torture commenced immediately. He was thrown into a specialized solitary confinement cell known as Little Ease. This pitch-black stone cube measured exactly 2 meters in every direction. It was specifically designed to prevent a human being from either standing upright or lying flat, forcing the prisoner to remain indefinitely in a cramped, agonizing crouch until severe muscle spasms locked the body into a state of continuous pain. On July 25, 1581, the state executed a classified diplomatic maneuver. Campion was secretly removed from Little Ease and transported by boat to the private mansion of his former patron, the Earl of Leicester. He was brought into a secure room to face the supreme architects of Tudor power, Queen Elizabeth I, the Earl of Leicester, and Lord Burghley, William Cecil. The state accurately recognized the geopolitical danger of creating a high-profile Catholic martyr. They offered Campion a staggering compromise. If he would attend a single Anglican service and formally acknowledge Queen Elizabeth as the supreme head of the Church, he would receive a total, unconditional pardon. His academic honors would be immediately restored, and many Catholic historical accounts suggest he was even offered the highest ecclesiastical office in the realm, the Archbishop of Canterbury. Though debated by modern historians, the offer demonstrated the Crown's desperate need to secure his intellectual defection. Campion evaluated the monarchs and ministers who held his life in their hands and calmly refused. He reiterated his civic loyalty to the Queen in all temporal matters, but flatly stated that his soul and his theology belonged to God alone. His refusal to compromise his conscience exhausted the diplomatic options of the Crown, immediately activating the most brutal mechanical instruments of state violence. Under English common law, the use of torture to extract a confession was strictly illegal. To bypass the legal system, Lord Burghley and Sir Francis Walsingham directly drafted and signed a royal warrant, utilizing the Queen's absolute prerogative to legally authorize the use of the rack. Thomas Norton, the official rackmaster, and Owen Hopton, the lieutenant of the Tower, were tasked with the execution. The rack was a mechanical device engineered to systematically destroy human anatomy. Campion was stripped naked and laid flat on the wooden frame. His wrists and ankles were bound with ropes attached to rotating wooden cylinders. As the torturers engaged the mechanical levers, immense force stretched his body in opposite directions. The pressure ripped through connective tissue and ligaments, violently dislocating the ball and socket joints of his shoulders and hips and the hinge joints of his elbows and knees. Campion was subjected to this anatomical destruction at least 3 times, on August 9 to October 31, and later in November. His physical form was rendered totally useless. He could no longer stand, walk, or feed himself. Despite the total annihilation of his body, Campion maintained absolute operational discipline. He refused to confess to treason, and he adamantly refused to supply the intelligence network with the names of any Catholic sympathizers beyond those the state had already independently captured. Failing to break his physical endurance, the government attempted to break him psychologically. The state forced the crippled scholar into 4 publicized theological debates held in the chapel of the Tower of London. The conditions were asymmetric. Campion was denied access to reference books, given no time to prepare, and was in such extreme physical agony that he had to be carried into the room and propped up on a stool. He faced teams of well-rested, fully prepared Anglican scholars. Relying entirely on his encyclopedic memory and sheer intellectual dominance, Campion surgically deconstructed the arguments of the state's theologians. He exposed their logical fallacies and historical inaccuracies, leaving the government representatives publicly embarrassed and forcing the state to abruptly cancel the final sessions. Unable to defeat his intellect or his spirit, the state moved to eliminate him judicially. However, prosecuting him purely for religious dissent would validate his manifesto and cement his status as a martyr. The regime utilized the Treason Act of 1351, fabricating a fictional conspiracy known as the Rome and Reims plot. The indictment baselessly claimed Campion had conspired with foreign powers overseas to assassinate Queen Elizabeth and facilitate a military invasion of England. The trial commenced at Westminster Hall on November 14 and 20, 1581. It was a theater of procedural cruelty. When instructed by the judge to raise his right hand to swear the oath, Campion could not physically comply. The repeated sessions on the rack had so utterly shredded the ligaments of his shoulder that his right arm hung completely dead at his side. Another priest standing trial next to him had to step forward and manually lift Campion's broken arm into the air before the silent courtroom. Denied legal counsel, Campion acted as his own defense attorney. He brilliantly exposed the complete lack of physical evidence, the absence of any treasonous correspondence, and the compensated contradictions of the state's paid informants. He delivered his final, defining statement directly to the judges. In condemning us, you condemn all your own ancestors, all the ancient priests, bishops, and kings. You condemn all that was once the glory of England. The predetermined jury required only 1 hour to return a verdict of guilty. Upon hearing the mandatory sentence of death by drawing and quartering, Campion and his fellow condemned priests immediately began singing the Te Deum, a traditional hymn of praise, to thank God for the privilege of martyrdom. Because his dislocated joints rendered him paralyzed, Campion was strapped flat onto a hurdle, a rough wooden panel woven from reeds and tied to the back of a horse. He was dragged face up for 3 miles through the freezing rain, his body bouncing violently over jagged cobblestones and deep mud from the tower to the Tyburn gallows. Upon arrival, he was forced to stand in a wooden cart, and the executioner secured the hemp rope around his neck. When the cart was pulled away, Campion dropped. The executioner was under strict state orders not to let him die of strangulation. The rope was cut while Campion was still conscious. Buckets of cold water were thrown over him to ensure he was lucid for the brutal execution that followed. He was pinned down on the wooden butchering block to suffer the full, gruesome protocol of a traitor's death. The executioner commenced the brutal process of castration before driving a deep vertical blade across his torso. His vital organs were violently extracted and cast directly into a roaring fire positioned inches from his face, forcing the man to watch his own physical destruction. Campion's life only ended when the blade breached his chest cavity, allowing the executioner to tear his still beating heart from his body, holding it high above the silent crowd and roaring, "Behold the heart of a traitor!" The butchery concluded with the quartering. His head was severed with an axe, and the torso was hacked into 4 distinct pieces. The quarters were thrown into a boiling cauldron filled with pitch and cumin seeds to prevent putrefaction. The quarters were spiked above the 4 main gates of London, and his severed head was impaled on a sharp iron pike above London Bridge. The state expected this unparalleled savagery to permanently break the Catholic underground. Instead, it catalyzed a massive, enduring resistance. The Tudor regime had engineered the mechanical destruction of the rack and the executioner's blade to enforce absolute ideological conformity. Edmund Campion was canonized not just for his theology but for his endurance. His butchery exposed the paranoid reality hiding beneath the glittering surface of Elizabeth I's Golden Age, leaving history to answer one defining question: why could a state apparatus possessing the unilateral power to dismantle human anatomy remain so entirely powerless against the unyielding resolve of a single human soul?